Okay, so for this talk, we're going to take a look at Michael Sandel's piece called The Case Against Perfection. So in this piece, Sandel is going to argue that genetic engineering, either ourselves or our future children, is unethical. There's something unethical about it, at least for the purposes of enhancement. Now, for therapeutic purposes, that's a different story. But for enhancement purposes, there's going to be something morally bad about it. So that's the general aim of his paper, and his basic thesis is that genetic enhancement is bad because it undermines the giftedness of human character and human achievement. So it's going to undermine the giftedness of human life, or certain aspects of human life. Now, in order to make this case, he's going to draw on two parallel or analogous cases. The first one being that of athletics. So here he's going to explain how enhancement in athletics is bad, and for the same kind of reasons, enhancement, genetic engineering, is also bad. And then he's also going to draw a parallel case of parenting. All right, so there are two approaches to this issue of genetic enhancement. Now, I just want to clarify that what he's talking about is genetically altering our own genes for enhancement purposes in order to enhance certain capabilities of our own choosing. And he's also referring, probably even more so, to prenatal genetic enhancement. In other words, in vitro genetic engineering to enhance certain capacities of the future child, which are of the parents' choosing. So just think of designer babies. That's the basic idea here. Okay, so one way to approach this issue of genetic enhancement is to say that enhancement is bad because it diminishes the agency of the person whose achievements are enhanced. So here the idea is that we are all agents, which means that we act on our own accord, out of our own free will. Now, some may argue that enhancement is bad because it's no longer us who are performing the action, but rather the, say, performance enhancing drug or whatever. Probably the most straightforward example can come from sports. So say, for example, we learn that an athletic accomplishment, or an athlete accomplishes a really large feat, but that she does this after taking steroids, and we become disillusioned and think this is a bad thing. Okay, so Lance Armstrong is an example that comes to mind. But why are we disappointed? What explains our moral offensiveness? Well, one reason that can explain this is because the athlete is no longer the source of their own accomplishment. Rather, the performance-enhancing drug is. So that's one way of going about explaining our moral offense to enhancement, whether it be genetic enhancement or performance-enhancing drugs or whatever. But Sandel does not take this approach. So again, Michael Sandel does not take this approach to explaining the moral offense of enhancement. Rather, he takes a different approach. He's going to say that enhancement undermines the gifted character of human powers and achievements, which is bad because the fact that our achievements, our capacities are a gift, or can be understood as a gift, is something that's very valuable. And he's also going to explain how undermining the gifted character of life and of our achievements can also have some bad effects. All right, so what is the gifted character of human powers and achievements? What does he mean by this? Well, recognizing the giftedness of life involves recognizing a number of things. So there's a bunch of things sort of packed into this giftedness of life. So for one thing, recognizing the giftedness of life involves recognizing that our talents, they're not completely our own doing. Right? So here the idea is that some of our talents we are just born with, and there is something that's valuable about that. The fact that we are born with a really good memory, we happen to have a really good memory, or maybe some of us are really good at math or art. So these talents, the fact that we're born with them, is something that's valuable. Giftedness also involves recognizing that not everything in the world is open to whatever use we may desire or devise. Right? So recognizing giftedness involves recognizing that we're not in complete control of things. For example, our own capacities we're not in complete control of. They're largely predominantly a gift of nature, or at least to some degree a gift of nature. Now, according to Sandel, recognizing this giftedness of life, it does a lot of good things. First of all, it cultivates humility, which is a virtue. It's a good thing. It's also, he says it's partly a religious sensibility. For example, some people view life as a gift from God, but you don't have to be religious in order to recognize the giftedness of life. But it is a kind of a religious sensibility. Also, the fact that some human activity is the result of natural talents and giftedness, it partly explains why we admire that activity. So take sports, and he's going to talk about this a little bit more. Part of why we admire athletes is because it's a display of natural talents. And that partly explains why we admire these feats. It's because they're a kind of display of natural talents. Right, so he does draw this parallel with sports. So take, for example, there are two highly achieving athletes. Call them X and Y. Now, X's achievements are due mostly to a lot of striving and practice and not so much natural talent. So we admire this person, we admire their achievements, partly because there's a lot of practice and striving involved. But say there's athlete Y, who performs these great feats, has a lot of achievements, but they're due mostly just to natural talent. Maybe this person doesn't really need to practice as much. Nevertheless, we still admire those feats because they are a display of natural talent. Now, let's say that we admire these athletes, but we then find out that they had been using performance-enhancing drugs. Now, what explains our moral offense at Y? Well, according to Sandel, the real problem with genetically altered athletes is that they corrupt athletic competition as an activity that honors the cultivation and display of natural talent. So that's part of the point of sports. Just take the Olympics. Part of the point is to honor and cultivate this display of natural talents. And so we can see that that's part of the point when we sort of become aware of our reaction to somebody who used performance-enhancing drugs. Right, so then he draws a parallel with parenting. So parents genetically engineering their future child, in vitro genetic engineering, it, according to Sandel, prevents them from accepting their child as a gift. Now, what's wrong with this? So he gives an explanation here. And that explanation relies on this idea of accepting love versus transforming love. So first of all, it undermines accepting love, and it promotes an attitude that our children are objects of our own design. So the idea here, I think, is fairly simple. Parenting involves unconditional love, and that's part of what he means by accepting love. We accept our children as they are, with whatever flaws they may have. Nevertheless, we still love them. This idea of genetically engineering our children in order to have certain features, it, according to Sandel, will start to undermine accepting children as they are, because we start to view children as objects of our own design, that we can design children as we please. And that's going to undermine accepting love, or what you might also call unconditional love. And this kind of love, it affirms the being of the child. So good parenting requires a balance between these two kinds of love, accepting love and transforming love, which seeks the well-being of the child. When we exercise transforming love, we will try to help the child out and change the child for the better, but we ought to also maintain a balance with accepting the child as he or she is. So there's a little quote by Sandel about accepting love versus transforming love. But the main problem is that genetic engineering, or at least this practice of genetic engineering, if it becomes widely acceptable, becomes widely practiced, it will threaten to throw off this balance between accepting love and transforming love, and it'll start to favor transforming love over accepting love. Okay, so the main problem, I think, is that if we start to engage in this practice of designing our future children, we'll see children not really as a gift, but rather as objects of our own design and desires. Okay, so here's an objection to Sandel. So for Sandel, genetically enhancing our children is bad, designer babies are bad. But one can object and say, we improve our children all the time, and this is considered a good thing. In fact, the way that we improve our children has an impact on their genetics, on their biology. For example, if you feed a child a very healthy diet, that's going to have a genetic impact. And that's perfectly acceptable. In fact, that's something that we should do. So what's the difference between doing that and genetically engineering our children? Because the outcome is the same. We're basically altering the genes in both cases in order to improve our future children. Other examples could be hiring tutors for our children, sending them to camp, piano lessons, SAT prep courses, so on and so forth. So the main issue here, according to the objection, is that we do all kinds of things to improve our children that aren't morally different from genetically engineering our children. So there is no moral difference between these two cases according to the objection. Okay, so in order for Sandel to respond to this objection, he's going to have to explain what is the moral difference between genetically engineering a child or future child, in vitro genetic engineering, versus altering the biology of our children through acceptable practices, such as what we feed our children, giving them piano lessons, so on and so forth. So he needs to explain what the difference is between those two cases. So here's his response. He says, genetic enhancement, it highlights a problem with the trend toward hyperparenting. So this is how he explains the problem. He says, this trend, it indicates society's demand to improve our performance and perfect our nature. This demand for performance and perfection animates the impulse to rail against the given. For him, that's the deepest source of all the moral trouble with enhancement. So it rails against the given, the giftedness of life. And that's bad according to Sandel. Okay. So he draws a parallel case with abortion. So imagine a couple contemplates abortion because a child would have certain characteristics that they don't want, whatever they may not want. So let's say they know through genetic testing that the child will be dyslexic, that the child will have blue eyes, they don't want blue eyes, or that the child will have brown eyes, they don't want brown eyes, introverted or extroverted, they don't want one or the other. So through genetic testing, they see that the child is going to have certain traits, and so they abort the fetus. Is this problematic? In other words, is abortion for this reason morally problematic? And a lot of people will say it is problematic. And that suggests that choosing a child based off of eugenic preference, a preference of traits, is also morally troubling. So in both cases, the case of abortion for these reasons and the case of genetic engineering of children to have desirable traits or whatever traits the parents want, these are both problematic. And part of the reason that Sandel is going to suggest is that